Hey everyone. Today we have a talk about creating companies where people thrive. Welcome to Invincible Innovation Live Show. I'm so glad that you're here. I'm Mazor, Kario, product innovation and value creation expert, and I'll be your host. And today I have a very special guest. Hi Heather.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm so happy that you're here. Heather Polivka is the CEO and advisor at HeatherPSolutions.
Yes.
And I'm sure it's going to be like a really interesting talk. We're live on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook, and you're so invited to ask this question and join the discussion. So now we can start. So I know that you're working with so many companies, and I know that you see some kind of a gap consistently within companies. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, what's interesting is the gap is very consistent, and it was the gap that existed pre-pandemic, but we're seeing people kind of lower their tolerance level for the gap. And the gap that I see is the gap between who a company says they are, and in some cases they believe they are, or the leaders believe they are, excuse me, and the actual lived experience that employees have within the organization. So it's kind of like if we were to buy a product and they say it does all these amazing, wonderful things, and then you get it home and it's like, wah, wah, it doesn't maybe quite do what it says it does, or it does it in a way, but not in the way it was you kind of understood it to be. And what's tough is you can take a product back to the store to return it. I think that's what we're seeing with the great resignation or the great reshuffle, or however we want to term it, is employees saying, I want to get what I authentically signed up for, because the relationship between employer and employee is just that, it's a relationship. And so when there's a gap between who we say we are and how it's experienced, that almost occurs as though we're not being authentic in the relationship.
Yeah, I totally understand what you're saying. It seems like companies invest lots of time in thinking about their brand and values and think that will work really well for customers and for potential employees, but it's so hard to really sustain it afterwards. And and how do you go from these like big words and values to something which is daily? And that's one question. And the second one is, what do you think about this great resignation? So how do you think it's like turned into this really big trend?
Yeah. Um, okay. So the first thing, how does it become sort of alive and real? I think it's a really good point of seeing words on a website that are the values, but is that really the reality inside? And what's interesting about that is that work gets done, but then it never, the hard work, because the easy work, and I work in branding and that too, the easy work um, is coming up with the brand. The easy work is saying this is what our mission, our values are going to be. The hard work is putting it into practice, as you pointed to. And if you think about it, we're seeing that continue to play out right now as companies spend much more money on attracting talent than they're spending on retaining talent. So again,
Sure.
doing the thing like the easy quick fix versus the hard work, which actually produces a sustainable solution and a sustainable business result. So, one of the things that is most often missing in companies that I go into is once they've said these are the values, most companies, and I mean literally 95% of companies, miss the work of defining those values in terms of behaviors. These are the behaviors we're going to reward. These are the behaviors that, might be acceptable, but these are the ones we're not going to tolerate. And that definition of the behaviors is really important, because you can get one leader leading the value of innovation like it's a competitive Lord of the Flies exercise, and another leader in that same organization leading innovation with this idea of like, no, let's bring some customers to the table and diverse perspectives and point of view and make this collaborative where we full contact dialogue and the best ideas, but together we'll win. Those are both a route to innovation. I know that you and I would argue one is better than the other,
Yeah.
um, but if we don't define the behaviors, how do you hold the leaders to account for leading innovation in the way that you want it to flourish within your organization, you can't. So that's like the trickle down effect of not defining those behaviors, is then you can't hold people accountable to them. And then you end up with subcultures in different pockets of the organization. And then you have this inconsistent experience, and that starts to really break down the overall experience for the company. So I would say that most often it's doing that definition work and then allowing room for all of us to grow and develop into the new definition, but holding us accountable if we do not. And that is what is missing. I think that answered the first question.
Yeah, I have another, we'll go back to the great resignation because I'm really trying to understand that. But I want to tell you that usually when we're talking about behaviors in business, we usually hear, the very extreme use cases of misbehaving. We don't really hear much about how we should do things, more about how we shouldn't, right?
Yes,
and,
yeah.
and it's so important.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, exactly. I got so excited about that point because that's why when I work with companies to define behaviors, I actually put them into 3 buckets, not just 2. One is, these are the buckets we really want to advocate and reward and elevate and highlight. These are the behaviors that'll be tolerated, but they're not necessarily, they're acceptable, but they're not the things that we're going to exemplify and highlight. And then here's the ones that are not tolerated. And I think by starting to do that, then you have a room that someone might be showing up and leading innovation just fine, but you have room to help them grow and to say, this works, but this will work even better. This is what, this is the leadership and the behaviors we want to exemplify. And I think all 3 buckets are important for that reason.
Yeah, and would you say that different roles or different departments needs to emphasize different types of behaviors? If you have like 5, you need more in innovation, and maybe in sales different things, and operations needs different things, or they all need to comply to the same behaviors?
I think they all need to comply to the same behaviors. Now, the outputs of that, like how you're going to innovate, in your sales organization versus how you're going to innovate in operations, or how you're going to innovate in the marketing department, the output will be very different. But when we think about behaviors, we're thinking like, okay, let's say we define innovation as there's no such thing as a bad idea, just ideas that need to be explored until they're exhausted. I just made that one up. Well, you would want that same behavior if you're in marketing as if you were in sales, and you define there's a time and place. When we're brainstorming, there's no bad ideas, just ideas that have to be exhausted, and they get explored, and then they get set aside, but not because they're bad, but because they just don't happen to work for whatever it is we're trying to solve for. So I think the behaviors are the same across the organization. I think that similarity of behavior is really important. Again, what we reward and what we're not going to tolerate.
I see. And if we're talking about this gap that was like years before, and now it's like accelerated. So tell me, what has changed during these 2 years of the pandemic? How do you see that?
Well, unfortunately, I think the pandemic lowered the water level, so to speak, to show the gap. I will say I have a lot of compassion for our talent acquisition and recruiting functions. Pre-pandemic, they were able to cover for a lot of the gap. So if a leader was toxic and had a lot of turnover, talent acquisition could just keep putting people into the chairs, and no one was sort of the wiser, even though recruiting knew that was a toxic leader with turnover. The market was such that they could cover for it. Well, I think the pandemic, companies had to make a lot of choices, and not even just the decisions they made, but how they made them and how they implemented those decisions told people a lot about who they really are, what they really value. There are companies that had to do massive layoffs, but they did it in a really compassionate way. And then there are companies that handled it not so well. And I think the pandemic lowered the water level such that people are like, yeah, I thought this before, but now I really see it. I really see when push comes to shove, how you're going to be as a company and how you're going to show up. and I'm not interested. And unfortunately, now the talent acquisition and recruiting functions, they can't compensate for that. They can't compensate for cultures that have been unhealthy for a while. They can't compensate for leaders that have led in really toxic and unhealthy ways. TA and recruiting can't compensate because the water level has really revealed how big those gaps are.
Yeah, like in Israel, we have a huge problem of we don't have enough talent for all the startups and high tech in Israel.
Yeah.
And it's a big fight over talent.
Yeah.
Really, you see so many companies investing tons of money in order to advertise for employees and about their brand.
Yeah.
And what is different, I think, that in Israel, it's such a small company and it's not small, it's a small country, and people know each other. So even if they don't go to Glassdoor or something like that, I will know someone within the company in a minute. So I know somebody who knows someone who works there.
Yes.
And it's so hard to cover that over like things that they're doing
Right.
or managers they're taking in. So sometimes there are like great managers for their results, but not for their employees. So maybe their managers really love what they're doing, but their employees don't really like them. And that's a problem because he's measured by what he's doing and not what the employees are saying about him in many cases. So I think that in the US, especially in enterprise, it's very, people take into consideration what your peers are saying, people that are your employees, people above you. Is it like,
I don't think
no?
so, not so much. So
No?
I love the example that you talked about, because I think that's another thing that's really showing up now is that companies have valued managers for the work and the output, but not whether they're really good people leaders. And some examples is it's very common for the best salesperson to get promoted to sales manager, or the person who's been in customer service the longest to get promoted to sales manager. And in the industries that are really hurting, and you mentioned one right now, technology, finance, healthcare, they have valued technical skills over people leadership skills. And so we are seeing it so prevalent here in the US, even though we have 360-degree reviews. In a lot of companies, you don't do a 360-degree review unless a problem has been noted with the leader. And that means it's gotten bad enough.
Yeah.
So what happens is people get promoted into a manager role, and only 30% of them get any training. So only 30% of managers have any training, and most of that is not people leadership skills. Most of it is operational, how to onboard someone in the system, how to get them a new computer, how to do payroll, or it's technical. And now we are seeing in technology and in finance and in healthcare in particular, but I would say very prevalent, a lot of people saying, my manager doesn't actually know how to lead people. And during the pandemic, that showed a great deal. And right now, people need a people-centric leader. They need an empathetic leader. They need someone who supports and empowers them, removes roadblocks, gets them the resources, not someone who's like standing over their shoulder, like making sure they're making the widgets. So we are seeing a huge gap here in the US, and it sounds like globally, in terms of first line, second line, middle management, leadership skills. And that's actually part of why inside of my work, we developed a new manager development program called Awesome People Leaders. And it is all micro learnings. It's all mobile enabled. And the idea is like 10 or 15 minutes. You watch a video, you get a download of a marketing collateral kind of piece on a topic, so you can absorb it very quickly, apply it to your work, and then next week do your next 10 to 15 minute lesson. So it works the way our brains work. It works the way work works, but we're just trying to shore up this huge gap in people leadership skills, because the number one reason someone will leave a job is because of their manager.
Yeah,
and 70% of engagement is determined by the employee's relationship with their manager. So if you have managers who actually don't know how to lead people, they just know how to manage work, it's insufficient for the times that we're in.
Yeah, like it relates to what we just said, that if you're measured only by your bottom line, and sometimes managers take credit for their employees' work in that case, and if you're measuring only bottom line, nobody would really know what's really going on, and these employees are doing their best, and right now it feels that they need more empathy from their managers, and it's been like very two hard years for everyone, and you had this the balance between going to work and staying at home and your family life and your hobbies and what you're doing is has changed tremendously. And now people are saying, okay, I have these like hours a day, I can commute like half of the time or not, I can like what I decide to do. And I think that it's more than that, because the companies, most of them did not lose money. Most of them who knew how to manage. So
Right.
if you're doing it without monitoring me here behind my back, behind my shoulder, so why should I come to work and have this like overload of going to work, commuting, everything all at once?
Yeah, I mean, it's it is super interesting that when you think about during the pandemic, it became very clear of who creates value for the organization. It was the people who, kept working, whether it was on the front lines and they had to be in person, or the people who very quickly overnight adapted to working from home. And how many companies actually increase their profitability, increase their revenue is pretty crazy. Um, so yeah, and in fact, I used to make that trade-off too. I'd be like, okay, it takes me this long to get ready and this long to drive. So if I go into work, I'll split the difference. I'll give half of it to the company and I'll take half of it for myself and my and
Yeah,
my
makes
life.
sense.
And I do think companies that are trying to mandate, like now come into the office, I think are facing a lot of resistance because people are saying, give me a reason why. And the reason that we need to, it's for our culture, is kind of BS. And what I mean by that is, again, it's about a shortcut. So a lot of companies, their culture, and by culture, we mean how we work, how we interact, how we make decisions. A lot of that was set up for in-person environments. And then overnight, companies had to go remote. Um, then to say that you have to come back in the office for our culture is laziness. And and what I mean by that is it's sort of like if you had a desktop website and you go and you try to use it on your mobile phone, and all of a sudden the experience is kind of wonky. Most companies would say, oh, then we need to design a responsive website, one that works whether you're on your phone or you're at a desktop. So why is the answer any different when it comes to our employees? If that's the answer for consumers trying to shop, why is the answer any different for employees? What really needs to be done is the work to then evolve the culture, how we work, how we communicate, how we make decisions, so it can work both in person and remotely. And that's, again, it's sort of this doing the work so that you can have a culture that works in either way, and it still creates that sense of connection to the organization and the purpose, etc. I did recently have a company that reached out to me, and I loved their approach because they were one, they're like, we had a really strong connected in-person culture before the pandemic. And yeah, we've worked remotely and we've actually been more productive and more, more to the bottom line. But I love it because the CEO said, I will give up some of our profitability so that we can have that human connection. And I
Wow.
loved that heart and that sentiment. And also his approach was, how do we create the kind of environment or opportunities that make people want to come to the office? So it wasn't going to be a prescription of you need to be in 3 days a week, et cetera, et cetera. But he was really interested in how do we create a work environment that people want to come and be in person and that works for them. And so we started having the conversation about, okay, well, women have been unduly impacted during the pandemic as they took on distance learning. And oh my God, I love to cook and I was so tired of cooking. Um,
Yeah.
so do you start having 9 to 3, work meetings are between 9 and 3. So that enables daycare drop off, senior care drop off and pickup. And by the way, everyone loves that. So I love that exploration of one, let's adjust our culture so it can work hybrid, remote, or in person. Let's do that work. And then secondly, if we want people in the office, let's give them a compelling reason why. And productivity is not the answer, but neither is culture. But I do think human connection is a great reason.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It seems that people forgot what is the meaning of just meeting people in these small talks and just having coffee, because it's like when you're online, I feel it myself, because usually I was like 2, 3, 4 days a week I was out of the office in my clients offices, and I really loved going to different clients, just chatting with them, getting to know some of them are my friends already, and now it's like all online. So it's like the default is online. It's like online call, and once in a while, if we don't want to do something different, I would go and meet them. And for me, it's like one of the reasons of doing things in general is to be with people, and there are so many things you cannot really transfer when you have this like part of your body and your own work, and there's less chit chatting in the beginning.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting where we would go, because people on one side want their freedom and they want to be trusted. I think it's related to trust, the fact that you can trust me. You don't need to see me in the office in order for me to work,
Right.
right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
and,
Well,
and
that's
it
why
makes sense.
I love the sentiment of the CEO, because one of the things that the US can be in an unhealthy way, very productivity driven. Um, there's the saying that in the US, unfortunately, we live to work, and other parts of the world, work to live. And I love the work to live philosophy much more. And I think a lot of Americans discovered that also during the pandemic, going, I actually don't want my life so busy. I actually don't want, I don't want to be where I leave the house at 7 a.m. and I'm not home until 10 o'clock at night because I'm working, and then all these activities, etc. So I loved the sentiment of the leader I referenced earlier, who was willing to give up a little bit of productivity in the short term, because he sees the value in having this human connection, not just for the individual employee, and I think mental health and well-being and having that connection, but also he sees the benefit for the company over the long term. If we create, the stronger the sense of community, and no, it doesn't have to look just one way in the office, but let's not forget that that is a way, and a really powerful way, to create connection. So that is an unusual sentiment to hear an executive being willing to openly say, I will trade some productivity for creating this connection. And I really commended him for that.
So what is preventing people from thriving in their workplace? What is the challenge here?
I still think that the number one thing that prevents people from thriving is their direct supervisor, and not out of any ill intent. No one becomes a manager or a leader and says, I want to be the person people complain about when they go to happy hour. No one signs up for that, but they don't know any better. They become a manager. They're not given any training or support. The company's expectations are around the productivity and producing widgets. The company doesn't promote people into executive leadership roles and say, we're promoting them because they are an excellent people leader. In fact, that is unheard of in the US, to say someone is promoted because they're a great people leader, which is really ironic when you think about it.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So they're being expected to produce a lot of stuff. They're not given any training and support. So people create their own models for leadership. They're like, okay, I had this boss. I didn't like what they did, so I'm going to not do that. And I had this boss that I like, so I'm going to try to cherry pick a piece or two from that. But I'm not even sure exactly what they did or how they did it, but I'll do my best and I'll figure it out. So we have a lot of leaders just trying to figure it out. And unfortunately, the people who pay the price for that are the ones who report into them. And then they get promoted, and it's not till they're 10 years into their career in the US and they're at a director level, and all of a sudden we're going to invest in leadership development and executive coaches and all of that. But think about all the people they led to get to a level where the company was willing to invest in them. And then a lot of the leadership development is undoing bad habits that were developed. And so I do think that's still the number one thing. And then number two thing is companies not doing the work and not holding people accountable for not leading through their values. One person, one leader that you keep around because they produce, even though they don't do it in a way that represents who you are, that will break your culture more than anything. And I talk to a lot of executive recruiters, and they say the top two questions that are being asked right now, one is culture, and the second is, do I have the flexibility to work in the way that works for me in my life? And so those are the top two things. And I've said everyone I know, I go, if you're interviewing for a role, ask them if they're spending as much, if not more, on retaining employees as they are on attracting them, because that'll tell you a lot. Are they going for the quick fix, or are they really investing for the future of the organization? Because companies that invest in retention, companies that invest in manager development, they are playing the long game. And that's the kind of place that you can go and build a career versus have it be a stop on the resume.
Yeah. Don't you think that people skills in general, communicating well, understanding people is something that is like your lifelong mission, more or less, for some people? And it's hard to train people who are not interested in other people. If they're interested in the numbers, if they're interested in the results, or their specific part of the role or technology that they're doing, it seems that it's really hard to teach that, no?
Yeah, it can be. And yet, if you're really interested in the numbers, and it's someday you want to lead other people in being interested in the numbers, or you really like the tech, and someday you want to be helping others who really like the tech, that's people leadership. So if that's the path you want to go down, then I think it's behooving upon us to, even though it may not be comfortable, it may be outside our comfort zones. It's, if we're going to lead people, those are the skills that we need to develop. That's why, I really have appreciated that some organizations have created a path for technical people. I'll say I've seen this a lot in technology, where you can continue to advance in your technical career, but that doesn't mean that you're a people leader. It means you advance as a thought leader in technology, because who you are innately is an individual contributor, but you're going to just contribute at an unprecedented level. And I think that's appropriate. I think that demonstrates a lot of emotional intelligence to know who I am as a person and what fuels me. And if it's not leading people, then I shouldn't do that. But unfortunately, that's not a broad adoption across a lot of companies. So in order to advance in your career, people feel like they have to take it on. But then secondly, I'll share a conversation I had with a chief technology officer, because one of the things that we do in the Awesome People Leader program is the first thing we start off with is brain science and how our brains work. Because if you're leading humans, you're leading everyone with brains, and how the threat response, that fight, flight, or freeze, is not a zone of the brain where we can do any innovation. It's not a zone of the brain for collaboration, for problem solving, and it's not a zone of the brain for productivity. So we talk about the three zones, the fear zone, the productivity zone of the brain, and then the reward function of the brain, and how that works. And how, as leaders, we've got to be triggering the reward response in the brain of our employees to help get those innovative ideas, that collaboration and the problem solving. So after the session with the chief technology officer, and he said, Heather, I've been in a lot of these leadership development sessions, but for the first time, someone explained the science behind recognition, the science behind positive reinforcing feedback. He goes, I just thought before they just wanted me to thank someone for doing their job. And he goes, and I didn't understand why people needed that. So even with someone who is so highly technical, if we also explain the science behind it, you could hear how he could get behind the science. And all of a sudden he goes, you've transformed my leadership in terms of recognition and positive reinforcing feedback, because I finally get the science. So I even think with those technical people, there's a way we can get in there.
Yeah, I always work with technical people. I really enjoy working with them. But people skills are not the first thing that people would say about them, right?
Yes.
So it's like trying to tackle to open a new way of thinking for some people, and it demands their interest and motivation in order to do so, which they don't always have, I guess. And you have lots of work. That's what I'm
Yeah.
saying.
But we all have our areas, right? We all have our
Sure.
areas to lead and to grow and to develop. And I want to create a lot of space for those who maybe don't feel as comfortable in the people leadership, because it might be easier to deal with numbers than deal with humans. In fact, it is easier to deal with numbers than deal with
Yeah.
humans.
Yeah, it is.
So we all have room to grow and to develop. And I want to create some grace for that, but we have to give them the opportunity to develop those skills and the resources and the training and the development.
So, what are the three ingredients that make up the secret sauce of engagement?
Ooh, secret sauce of engagement. Well, what's interesting is engagement's actually an outcome. And so we have a lot of companies like, oh, we need to work on engagement, but it's actually an outcome. And it's an outcome of the employee experience. And in the employee experience, it really is, we're going to go back to where we started this conversation. It's who a company says they are and what they say they value, and how that shows up into 8 different areas of the employee experience. And not that those are the only 8, but they're the 8 that lots of studies and science have shown are the most prevalent and important to employees. And when a company walks their talk in those 8 areas, it's sort of like, oh, you did what you said you were going to do. You showed up the way you said you were going to show up. And so then I, as an employee, I have increased engagement. And so that's the outcome that gets developed. The problem is that engagement has been largely unmoved. I can speak to the US, largely unmoved for a couple of decades. And the only time, even though we know this, we've done all these studies, we know this, we know how engagement fuels the bottom line, but still has been unmoved. And so one of the only time we saw movement engagement is in the first 4 months of the pandemic, interestingly enough. It's the only time we've seen a notable shift and increase in engagement. But it's not a surprise when you think about it. Companies were over communicating. They were very quickly adapting and adjusting and doing the best they could. I think companies were being really human about, oh, we're trying to figure this stuff out. We don't know. We went overnight. They demonstrated they cared about employees. And so all of a sudden, you have this over communication, you have this vulnerability in leadership, and you have this, we really care about you. And shocking, engagement goes up. And then we get a little fatigued. And by the September of 2020, engagement was back to pre-COVID levels. And they've largely remained there. And part of it is, again, it's not looking at, as a company, are we walking the talk in 8 areas of the employee work experience? And that's why engagement remains largely untouched. So I say it's about walking your talk in the 8 areas of the employee experience in a way that generates the reward function of the brain. So when you say the 3, people might be going, but she asked for 3, Heather, and you're talking about 8. So 1 is walking the talk. 2, in the 8 areas of the employee experience. 3, in a way that triggers the reward function of our brain. Companies that do that have higher engagement.
So, how do you measure engagement? You're saying like it went up, it went down. I'm wondering, how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, largely through employee surveys and ad hoc. I mean, the annual employee survey, I would like most companies to do away with that. I would rather that they sort of do sampling drip surveys all year long. And it will better serve the employees, but it will also better serve the companies. Because I've worked in companies that do that annual survey. And so then all of a sudden it's like a month before the survey, all the managers are trying to do and say the right things because they know the survey is coming up. And then the survey happens and the employees go, no one really listens or does anything from this anyways, but I don't want to be that person. I literally had a boss once. This is awful. I had a boss who did not get as high of an employee engagement result as they wanted. And then they made all of us sit through like 8 sessions going question by question to discuss who answered something and why they answered it that way. And I said, if you want to kill your engagement, you're doing that. I mean, it was the most awful
Wow.
experience. But that's what happened.
Investigation. It sounds like an investigation.
It really was, right? And had that employee survey been an ongoing continuous sampling group, then that leader would have seen a dramatic dip in their engagement by approaching it in that way. But that's the problem with annual employee engagement surveys.
Yeah. So before we have like lots of things that we didn't cover, but I want to talk about mindset and why you think it's so important and how you see it in general. You know, it's like a buzzword and everybody would say something different. So how do you see mindset as part of what you're doing?
You know, it's interesting. There's, I think about mindset of leadership, which I've already pointed to, the brain science of what part of the brain are people functioning in. And you pointed to this earlier that the last 2 years have been really hard.
Sure.
And there's a lot of unprocessed grief, a lot of unprocessed trauma. And I think we have a lot of people who are right on the precipice of that fear response. And so any small thing can trigger us into fight, flight, or freeze until we can work through what we have all been through these past years and what we're continuing to go through. And there's things that we've all shared in this pandemic, but then there's also been very individual experiences and losses. And, you know, I think about like families who weren't able to gather for weddings or funerals, you know, that has an impact on us. So I think of mindset in that broad way of, you know, as a collective consciousness, we have things that we need to process and we need to take care of one another and ourselves. So that's my macro mindset. And then as a leader, it's recognizing that is our experience and our employees, that all of us are part of that humanity. And then as an entrepreneur, because I started my consulting business right as the pandemic hit, mindset has been critical for me in terms of being able to run my business in a way that I didn't expect. And so when I think about that, it's answering on all those levels. That gets pretty complicated. But what I do know is I know when I take care of myself and I do mindset work, and for me, that can be journaling, that can be meditation, that can just be spending 5 minutes reading some inspiring quotes that speak to me. But when I spend just the smallest amount of time in that, I show up as a better version of myself throughout the whole day. And if something happens in the day, I can feel it's thrown me off. And pausing and taking 5 minutes to set myself straight in a sense, get recentered and grounded in who I am and what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. Again, it allows me to show up in my best possible way. So I have both a personal relationship to mindset, but also on a macro lens. I think it's just accepting we've got a lot of shared humanity right now. We always have, but it's on display. It's right on the surface. And I think it's just a call for all of us to be a little more gentle with ourselves and a lot more gentle with each other.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And it seems like the anxiety level that people got from these 2 years influenced their mental health and the way they're thinking. And I think that right now we're seeing it even more. It's like an after effect right now that we're seeing. And I think that people understand their own emotions better and others' emotions better. And this is like their calling in order to just listen to it. Because maybe before you could have just overworked, of done so many other things and you didn't listen to it. And now it's like hard not to hear it, I guess. And it's so important, and it's like an insight that people got, not in theory, but in their own experience of life.
Yes.
And I totally agree with you that's important. So we're almost done, and I have only one last question. So what's your number one tip for leaders today?
My number one tip for leaders is I would leave them with understanding that they're leading human beings with brains. And as such, have a lot of capacity for their humanity. But secondly, learn to understand how the brain functions. That'll make you much more powerful as a leader in helping move your people away from the fight, flight, or freeze and get them into the reward function of the zone where they get to show up as their best. And then they appreciate you as the kind of leader that helps them operate in that space. Those are the kinds of leaders they want to stay with. Those are the kinds of leaders they want to work for. And if they have a question about that, they can reach out to me, and I'd be happy to help them with that.
Sure. So tell me, how can people reach out and hear more about what you're doing?
Yeah. Well, you can definitely connect with me on LinkedIn, Heather Polivka, and they can see the spelling on the screen. It's there's not many of us, so it's easy to find. They can also reach out to me via awesomepeopleleaders.com for our manager development program, or HeatherPSolutions. And on every single one of our websites, there's a way that you can set up time with me, and I would love that.
Sure. So thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Heather, and lots of insights from our talk. So thanks for that.
Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Sure. And to all of you change makers out there, thank you for joining us. And if you want to learn more, you're so invited to invincibleinnovation.com. And I'll see you next week with another innovative, insightful talk. See ya.